On behalf of UNICEF, East Asia-Pacific Regional Office, as well as the Regional Office for South Asia and our headquarters, we are very proud to welcome you to the Building Better Brains. How do we translate the neuroscience evidence to benefit children's development session? The United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and the UNICEF Executive Director, Mr. Tony Lake, have both called for an early childhood revolution. It's a revolution, as we have been told several times, in which we recognize that child development is about so much more than teaching children their numbers and letters. Driven by evidence emerging from neuroscience, economics, biological and social sciences, world leaders are now called on and are committing to understanding ECD holistically, requiring integrated inputs from all sectors and not education alone. Today, for the first time in this region, we bring together neuroscientists from around the world. Thanks to you all for joining us. I hope that together we will be able to use this evidence from neuroscience to build better brains and towards more prosperous and peaceful societies.
You know, I think we've heard many times throughout this meeting about the importance of positive early environments, how they're critical for a child's development. So that's not new. But what science is now revealing is the why and the how that these environments impact a child's development, and in particular impact the developing brain. All of us in this room made a remarkable journey that over the first 2,000 days of our lives took us from a single cell to that child going off to school for the first day, full of excitement and ready to take on the world and her future. And what science reveals is that the basic architectural plan that specifies this development are contained within the DNA of that single cell. However, this genetic blueprint is molded and modified by the environments around that child, setting her on trajectories that will impact her lifelong health, her lifelong learning capabilities, and social functioning. Because this interaction between the genetic blueprint and the environments impact the holistic development of the child. So, what are these environments that the child, and particularly the child's brain, needs for optimal development? Well, simply put, the brain needs environments that are nourishing, that are stimulating, and that are protective. Nourishing because the brain needs energy during development. It actually utilizes over half, maybe 3/4 of all the energy intake of the child during development. It needs a balanced diet. It needs protein and lipid because these are the building blocks of the cells that form the brain. And we know that malnourishment in children stunts their growth, and equally, stunted brain growth has a devastating long-term impact on structure and function of the brain. We know stimulation is important because the developing brain of the child craves stimulation from touching, seeing, hearing, playing, learning, and craves nurturing care. Stimulation is essential for the formation of the connections between the neurons in the developing brain, so that neural networks can be formed that are the basis of cognitive and social development and brain function. We know that a lack of stimulation or neglect during critical windows of development in early life lead to a brain that will fail to reach its full potential. And we know that protection is important because the formation of new brain cells and new brain connections can be damaged by environments that are abusive or filled with violence or conflict. Chronic stress resulting from such environments leads to prolonged exposure to stress hormones such as cortisol. And cortisol at high levels for long periods of time is toxic to nerve cells. It reduces the number that are formed and reduces their ability to form connections between them. So that's the why early environments are important. How about the how? How do these environments actually impact the developing brain? Well, it appears that they impact in a way which affects the genetic blueprint for development. Environments don't change the genetic sequence of our DNA, but they do place a chemical mark on that DNA in such a way that it alters whether genes are turned on or off. It's a process we call epigenetics. The epigenetic modification of our genetic blueprint can be affected adversely by adverse environments, setting children on poor trajectories, but optimal environments can epigenetically modify the blueprint positively so that children develop optimally.
And so that's a kind of a lifelong trajectory.
Well, it not only affects that child lifelong, but there are data that in some cases that marking of the DNA can be passed on to future generations, resulting in transgenerational impacts of poverty and adversity.
Right, right. So that kind of relates very nicely, Judy, to the work that you're doing.
Our work with monkeys, with primates, has been really allowed us to get a good insight into how the brain develops. And so what we find is that you're born with almost all the brain cells, the neurons that you're going to have. What genetics does is it tells them to reach out and connect to each other. And so as each part of the brain is developing, lots and lots of connections are made, but they don't all last. Only some of them last. And the ones that last, so let's say just these last, rest are pruned away, and scientists use that word, pruned away.
Right.
The ones that last are the ones that get used again and again. Now, we used to think that that might be true for learned processes like reading, speaking, math skills, but it turns out it's true for everything. And so in young monkeys, when they have had their mother taken away, but they're still living in a family environment, they don't have as much one-on-one interaction. They learn a lot about how to pay attention, how to interpret expressions.
Body language.
Body language from their mother. If they don't have their mother there, they're pretty happy, they grow up, but they don't learn those kind of personal interactions. So it turns out that everything that the brain does is learned the same way. It needs to get used a lot in order for strong connections to build.
And that's why positive stimulation is so important.
Positive stimulation,
You're
and if
making
you
more
think
pathways.
about it, right, anything that you want the child to be able to do well later, you want to start getting them involved in and using those circuits. So it's not so important to learn skills you know in school early. It's important to learn to read emotions and be able to interpret Does somebody expect something from you? Is
Right.
somebody annoyed with you? Should you
So
modify
it's
your behavior?
social intelligence, emotional
Social intelligence. And so what we see is that if monkeys have not had that early and they don't develop strong pathways, they have problems with this all their lives. Yes, they can learn, but they have to use the weak pathways they have to learn.
Right.
They don't have really strong pathways to do that. And so that takes a lot of work on adults' parts. If we have a child who we would like to get to focus their attention and understand what's going on and how to socially interact, and they're more interested in playing with trucks or something, we have to be really creative and think of a clever way to get them to do what we know they need to do to build strong brain pathways.
Right,
So I
right.
think it means that adults need to use this information and make
to
it
parent more
really
effect-
fun for kids to do things. Kids will do things that they enjoy doing. If they don't enjoy doing them, they won't do them.
Right.
And they won't build strong brain pathways.
Right.
So the point is that the human brain in infancy has certain unique characteristics which are different from the adult brain. And that's why it's important to understand what the risk is, because this is a complex programmed process.
Right.
And if anything were to go wrong at any stage, it would produce profound and sometimes permanent effects, and hence every child is at risk. The neurons, the cells that Judy talked about, they are growing at a phenomenal rate. There are 250,000 being produced a minute.
Wow.
And we have like 100 billion cells. And as Judy said, not all of them are going to last. Some of them will die. Why will they die? Because either they have not been used, or that they have been subjected to some kind of a stress. And stress can be endogenous, coming from inside, or from outside, exogenous. The other unique thing is the presence of these critical windows and sensitive time periods.
Right.
The critical windows are really the time period during which the brain needs to be stimulated. The cells expect that they will, let's say, be stimulated by light. Now, if you don't have light in the beginning, you lose the capability of actually seeing light. That means you become blind. So the retinal cells will die if the critical period has gone without stimulation.
Right.
So it's as important as that.
Right, and so what you're saying is that you can see this on a physiological level, but later in life you can see it on an emotional level or a social
Yes.
level or an level of intelligence. And that's one of the reasons we see connections between very young children being kind of properly stimulated and doing well in school later.
Yes.
It's not so much because they have more knowledge, but because they have a brain that's been built better to handle those
Absolutely.
issues later.
So these critical windows go hand in hand with windows of opportunity, because that's the time when the brain is most plastic. And when we say plasticity, we mean the capability of the brain to modify itself both in structure and in function as a response to experience or stimulation.
Right.
So we can use actually these plasticity windows, as you said, to overcome these adversities. And that has important implications for intervention.
I work on a special children disorders, dyslexia. And language and reading is a most important ability in a modern society. But about 5 to 10% of children have extremely difficult in learning to read. So their main problem in reading and writing acquisition is their accuracy and fluency in word recognition and spelling. And actually, yeah, in 30 years ago, the scientists in the world think there's no dyslexia in Chinese language because we are not an alphabetic language. But in the past 30 years, lots of research has done, and we found Chinese children also have dyslexia. About 5 to 8% of children have such of the difficulties.
No kidding, fascinating.
Yeah, and also the main difficulty for Chinese children also they meet the difficulty in character and word reading and writing. So the similar problem as other languages. Their problem is spatial cognitive deficits, and they also have brain bases. For example, for language, there are two regions, the Broca and Wernicke regions are most important for language and reading. But for dyslexic children, their Wernicke regions will disactivate compared normal children. And the connection between Broca and Wernicke are much weaker than normal children.
So speaking of connections, you're the expert on connections because you actually work on something called connectomes, right? And when I read that, I was like, okay, I need to understand that better. And I'm sure everyone out here would like to understand it better too. So can you explain it?
So as we all know, the brain is a very complex network with very many neurons and connections linking these neurons. So I just give one example. So we have imaging technique to look at the brain structure and function. So actually there are many MR scanners around the world, including hospitals and scientific research institutions. So actually we can use this non-invasive cutting-edge technique to map brain structure and function, just like take photos, so it's safe. So connectomics is a new concept to use these cutting-edge techniques to describe how the brain is connected. So actually, previously we have used this method to map connectivity patterns of the healthy adult brain. For example, we have identified brain hubs with very many connections, just like Beijing, Shanghai in the transportation system.
Right.
So actually, these brain hubs are mainly located at the medial frontal cortex and medial parietal lobe. So the medial frontal cortex, if we look at the midline of the brain, so the medial frontal cortex is at the anterior part of the brain. So the medial parietal cortex is posterior part of the brain. So they are very important for information transfer across remote areas.
So
I think what makes this research come alive for us and changes it from abstract to we need to do something about that data. And I didn't coin the phrase, but it's a commonly used phrase: no data, no problem, no solution. So data have been very powerful in Australia in a couple of different ways. Country-specific data is much more valuable than relying on somebody else's data. So we have two major sets of data. One is the longitudinal study of Australian children that follows a representative cohort from birth. And we see differences between advantaged and disadvantaged children, those growing up in advantaged environments where they're stimulated in the way that our colleagues said, and those that aren't. As early as 2 or 3 years of age, we're starting to see systematic differences in language, cognition, behavior, and the brain development research tells us those differences don't close. It gets harder and harder to alter those pathways as children get older. So that made people sit up and take notice. But the biggest change in the social discourse has been the AEDI, the Australian Early Developmental Index, which is an Australian modification of the Canadian EDI. This is about a 100-item questionnaire completed online by a teacher in the child's first year of formal schooling. So our first lot of data was in about 9 years ago. We're now about to release our third wave of data. So we have data covering about 96% of all Australian 5-year-olds.
Wow. That's
mapped to every single community in the country and in the public domain.
Wow.
So that's really started to change the social discourse. So at a national level...
Because you now have this feedback, you have this hard evidence of what's going on, and there can be no argument about what's happening.
Correct. So nobody can deny there are issues with Australian children anymore, and we're a high-income country generally. So at a national level, 1 in 4 Australian children arrives at school in trouble. At a neighbourhood level, in some communities, 1 in 2, 2 in 3 kids have problems. So it's changed the national policy debate. So that's been very important. But even more important at a local level, it brings people to the table to discuss data in a way they wouldn't have been there before. And there are surprises to the data. So some communities we would expect to do well don't do so well. And some communities that are so-called disadvantaged do better than expected. So the people around the table are starting to say, well, why are we seeing this? And that's the first step then in coming up with solutions. So that's had a big impact on resource allocation locally, on reorganisation of services and so on.
Steve, when we were talking earlier, you were talking about some of the newer discoveries, and one of the big surprises was the microbiome.
Yeah, so Chip, science is ever changing, and there are a couple of really exciting emerging areas that I think people would be interested to hear about. First of all is this area called the microbiome. And what that refers to are the bacteria that populate our body. You might not be aware that we have more bacterial cells in our body than we have human cells. And these are good bacteria. They're bacteria that have co-evolved with us over millions of years. And actually, we need these bacteria in order to get nutrition out of our food, in order to undertake many of the functions that our body takes.
It's a symbiotic relationship.
It's a symbiotic relationship. These bacteria produce chemicals that impact our immune function, that impact our brain function. And what we know is that a child's microbiome develops over the first year or so of life. And the way in which it develops is critically important for that child's immune system and brain function. We know that malnourished children have damaged microbiomes, and that even if we give nourishment back to those children, they can't get the maximum benefit from it. So this science tells us something about nutritional interventions, that perhaps we have to repair their damaged microbiome at the same time that we're giving them nutrition. So, science is changing. It's changing the way we think, and it will inform how we look at interventions down the road.
Right. And that also speaks to, this is a biological issue that you're talking about, but it speaks to, again, these critical windows that we've talked about, and the importance of early emotional and social development. It's a lot easier, isn't it, Judy, to sort of do it right the first time as opposed to try to repair it later?
It is. It's much easier to get it right the first time. And when we go back to thinking about brain pathways that develop, what we've been able to show is that you can intervene after a period of stress, and your intervention can be very, very effective. But you need to intervene during that window of plasticity. So the timing makes a big difference. If you intervene quickly, you can repair the problems with the developing brain, and you can strengthen the pathways that were developing that got disrupted by stress. If you wait to intervene for a year, 2 years, then that's past the period of plasticity for that brain region, and it's very, very difficult to ever...
It's not impossible, it's just way more difficult.
Right.
And in terms of treatment or even costs, inside of an economy, a society, it's just, you're solving problems later when they're much more difficult to solve than getting them right the first time. And
right.
Steve, you look like you want to say something.
Yeah, I just want to say that These windows of opportunity have classically been thought of during pregnancy and infancy and childhood, but some of the newest data now is coming out saying that a mother's health pre-pregnancy and a father's health, both mental and physical, pre-pregnancy can impact the future development of that child.
Well, I think, again, because of our time constraints and because I know it's really important, we want to talk about how do we actually solve some of these problems. And I want to go back to Frank, because that's really the heart of the work that you're doing.
10, 12 years ago, when the brain development research was really developing momentum, and I was going around the country giving talks on the importance of things we've heard today, more and more people were coming up to me and saying, yeah, I know that research is important, but what do I do today? Right. And that led me and my centre to really start to focus on what do you do about this research. Disseminating the information is not enough. Having access to the information isn't enough. And that's what we mean by translational research. So we've been at it for over a decade now. And what we've tried to do is, and what we are trying to do, is to translate the research so it informs public policy, service delivery, professional practice, and parenting. And we've developed conceptual models for that. So for policymakers, we've got online publications and written publications, something called policy briefs that takes an issue on early childhood and translates the research in policy relevant terms. We assertively try and be on committees and working parties. We nurture relationships with ministers and advisors, etc. With professionals, we've tried to target every professional group who work with young children and parents, and we've got continuing education programs for early childhood professionals and nurses and so on. We've got online training programs, etc. And then for parents, we've got a government-funded website where everything is peer-reviewed.
Oh, wow, that's great.
And they can just download that. And we also then increasingly try and engage the media.
Right.
Because the popular media is more effective than any of us. I guess the lessons we've learned along the way, and we're still learning, language is important. Translating our language, not just for different cultural languages, but in ways that the various professional groups can understand. So we've learned.
You have these silos. You have.
Yeah, we've had
researchers don't think that or talk the same way that policymakers do.
Exactly. So the same message has to be written in different ways for different audiences. And let me give you a couple of examples of challenging language. ECEC, early childhood education and care. Well, that instantly excludes health and education. It's focused on education. So I like early childhood development because that's an embracing term that brings in all the various professional groups. Child mental health. When we talk child mental health in our country, people default immediately to mental illness, psychiatry, drugs. We don't want our kids on drugs.
Right.
So how do you inject mental health into the national debate without scaring everybody else? And I guess the other thing we've learned is this is not a one-time effort. This is an ongoing struggle, and we've tried to learn persistence. So every time a minister changes or the bureaucrats get shifted, we start all over again to try and do that. And that's very frustrating. So it really is a sort of holistic attempt, I suppose, to translate the research for all those different audiences and to keep on translating it.
In China, do you feel like you're making some progress in this kind of translational effort, to take the science and turn it into programs that get real change?
Yeah. Because I am working on dyslexia, actually dyslexic children, they made difficulties at school, but their problem much earlier, actually in preschool or at birth.
Right.
Yeah, so we have a longitudinal study. So we really would like to know what's the best predictors from preschool to predict their later reading access or failures. So then now we have found some very important factors. Two factors, one is phonological awareness, another is rapid naming. So those two factors just similar with alphabetic languages. Another special factor is morphological awareness. So if we found their really deficit, we can, now we are construct some special training program.
You can work on it early and
early children.
Eradicate
so
the problem.
At risk children can reduce their risk for dyslexia.
Right.
Another important factor we think is family and environment. So we found social economic status also very important for children's language development and dyslexia, especially mother education.
Right.
And also family environment, like books at home,
right.
and parent-child interaction. So all those factors.
So and that kind of goes back to what Judy was talking about. This social interaction that takes place between parents and children is feeding the brain. In a way that helps it do other things better.
Yeah, we really found, because in our longitudinal study, we found when children's 3 years parent-child interaction will affect their 40 years old brain, the connection between Broca and Wernicke, the connections. So we found such evidence. So now we think very important is how we can improve parents' education level, because in China still relatively low,
right.
And also how to train mothers and parents, make some technology, use some website or a game or something,
right.
to give children, even in the countryside, children, so more
right.
support.
So, Dr. Singhi, this isn't just about the children, it's about parenting too.
Yeah, I think I'd like to emphasize, Judy's already emphasized the timing of intervention.
Yes.
That is critically important. So is the content of the intervention.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we call so many things as intervention without realizing what we are doing. Intervention cannot be just in isolation with the child. It has to be holistic, has to involve at least the mother-infant duo, but also the family.
Mm-hmm.
And not only because of its inputs, sometimes for us, like, it was a necessity, because we don't have so many people to give intervention in resource-constrained environments. And therefore, involvement of the family was a necessity. And now even the West is realizing that even if you give intervention programs, if the family or the parents are not involved, then the outcomes are not lasting.
Right.
You may have a transient benefit, but it doesn't last.
Right.
So I think the very important point is to involve the parents, to also learn about their felt needs, in addition to what we think their child needs.
Right.
So
right.
That kind of interaction and understanding is extremely important. And then getting them to improve their parenting styles. I mean, some studies have found that even a simple thing like reading bedtime stories can help, the cognitive development of a child.
Right.
And what Steve was talking about, epigenetics. So not all children may be blessed with very, first-class genes, but epigenetics, which really means just modifying the environment, and you don't change the DNA, but you kind of stimulate the DNA.
You can boost it.
You can boost it.
Yeah.
So that kind of parenting styles are important, and these are very simple things.
Right.
We may use, higher
and parents
language.
want to do these
and
things.
Parents want to do
It's just
these
they need
things.
to know how.
Absolutely.
Which goes back to
So-
the translational, how do we actually do it? But I wanted to ask about your work on connectomes. Do you see that as you progress in that work, helping feed a better way to understand what we need to do and when we need to do it?
So actually, there are many different categories in which we can use to help to deal with real world problems. One example I just mentioned, the brain development at different time. So in newborns, we know the front cortex is not hard.
Right.
So even for children at very early stage, there are very few connections in this area.
Right.
So we know this frontal area is relevant to high cognitive functions such as attention, executive control, and the task switch.
Right.
So yeah, actually we know for children, so they cannot do some difficult tasks because they don't have very well organized front cortex. So they should respect this biological principles of early brain development. So we cannot ask students or children at very early stage to learn too much things.
Right.
So it's very important.
Right. Does that relate to the possibility that you can overstimulate children?
Stimulation, as I was saying, was taken, it's like a pendulum. You go this way and then you just go beyond what is really needed. And so in preterm babies, the so-called, baby-friendly nurseries were actually stimulating preterm so much that they were not able to sleep. And they were, they started having breathing irregularities.
No kidding.
And so, stimulation doesn't mean that you are constantly bombarding a baby with external stimuli.
Right.
And on the other hand, simple procedures, like, at least in India, the tradition was that a newborn baby is kept close to the mother's body. And, now we realize the multifactorial benefit that this simple procedure has. Right. And now it is being advocated in a fancy term called kangaroo mother care, because the baby has. So not only is it physiologically good for the baby, it promotes attachment and bonding, and again that warmth and that personal touch comes in. So one doesn't have to kind of give flickering lights or noises to stimulate a baby,
or lots of music,
and all, because it has to be physiological.
And it also has to be when the brain is prepared to handle it.
Absolutely. The entry has to be at the right time. I mean, you can't wake up a sleeping baby because you're stimulating the baby. And then
wake up and get smart. Yeah.
So all those things have to be kept in mind, So it's really a complex process, but at the same time very simple if you follow the principles.
Yeah, it's just
so you don't need sophisticated equipment to do some stimulation.
Right.
These are just day-to-day practices.
A good parent is a responsive parent, and there are three parts to that. One is understanding child development, understanding the child's needs at different levels for stimulation and the sort of things we've talked about. Secondly is picking up cues from the child, from the infant or the child, picking up and interpreting cues. And thirdly, having a repertoire of responses. So a crying baby, it might be hungry, might be wet, might be overstimulated, might want to be held. So they're the three components we think make a good parent, quote unquote.
Essentially, stay tuned into your child.
Well, understand child development, understand what the child needs, the sort of things we've heard this morning. Secondly, pick up cues, and they're very subtle cues, as Judy has said. And thirdly, have a repertoire of responses. It's not a one-side, if this doesn't work, maybe it's that, maybe it's that, maybe it's that, but to keep that relationship on track. So that's our best bet at a good parent. And
I mean, part of what we're saying is children's development is a moving target.
Correct.
So one strategy that works at 3 months might not work at 6 months or 9 months.
And one strategy that works in this child may not work in the second child because of temperament differences.
Right. Or relationship inside the family.
So parents need that sort of support to have the confidence to, trust their instincts. But, what's underlying all of that is the need for them to understand child development.
In the same vein, can I just say that, having groups of parents helps a lot. Parents learn, just as children learn from each other. Parents learn from each other. And so you don't necessarily have to have classes for telling them, this, but sometimes just having groups of parents of children with similar problems helps a lot. Not just to learn, but also to kind of alleviate their stress amongst each other, that they are not the only ones on this earth with those kind of problems. And then share experiences.
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of parents feel alone,
That's another component of into it.
Yeah, we have to recognize that poverty impacts children in multiple ways. And it's complex. And we need to, in our interventions, embrace and understand that complexity if we're to have interventions that are truly to be efficacy and cost effective.
Right.
And so, we've sort of proposed we need to start using this science to generate smart interventions. So they're interventions which are constructed in packages that can address the nutritional requirements of a child, the stimulation requirements of a child, and the nurturing and care and protective environments of a child at appropriate times that are appropriate to those windows of development.
Right. And doing that sort of requires breaking these silos down that Frank was talking about.
Absolutely. We've got to look beyond our academic and governmental silos of health and education and social services, because the child develops in a holistic way. It doesn't have a medical part of its brain and an education part of its brain and a social functioning part of its brain. And all of the brain cells are interacting with each other, and the brain regions, as we heard, are connected together. And we need to understand and model that holistic development in our interventions. And then also we need to, as Frank said, sustain our interventions across time. Expecting that a single intervention at a single point of time is going to cure everything is unrealistic.
Right.
That intervention needs to be, as I said, integrated as packages across time, and that time is probably going to be expanding, not just pregnancy, not just infancy, but we need to look at adolescents because they are going to be the next parents, and as I said, the health of the mother and the father and their level of stress going into a pregnancy affects their future children.
Right.
And then finally,
I'm sorry.
just say that they also need to be targeted, as we heard, because not all children will respond to the same intervention.
Before we go to question and answers, I wanted to make sure that Judy had an opportunity to talk about, so you've actually created a game that's called the
Brain Architecture Game.
Right.
So we've been faced with the fact that you've heard a lot of complex neuroscience today, and we're hoping that you can put this into action. But you haven't had many years of courses like we've had in neuroscience. And so how do you become familiar enough with the neuroscience to be able to think with it and come up with the right interventions for the right kids at the right times? This is difficult. And facing that, Working for Kids is trying to develop ways of introducing the public to the ideas about neuroscience, making everybody in a community feel comfortable with the neuroscience and be able to use it. One of the first things we've been working on is a game, and people enjoy playing games. Remember I said with kids, if people enjoy things, they'll do them over and over again, and that will build strong circuits. And we've taken that full circle to adults too. Adults will do things that they enjoy doing. So the brain architecture game, people they roll the dice, they get their genetics, and then they get life experience cards. You don't get to choose your life experience cards, they just happen to you, kind of like real life. And you have to build a brain. You're trying to make it as tall as possible so that it's well functioning, and so it can withstand stress. And in this game, weights hang on the brain, and the brain needs to stay standing.
They represent stress.
Right, they represent stress. So people really start to get the idea, oh, we need societal supports, we need community supports, we need them when the child is young. That helped us build this strong brain that could withstand stress. So it's a fun, exciting way to get that information out to the public.
Yeah, I love that. So why don't we take this question over here? first.
Thank you. I'm Sarah Watson. I run Ready Nation, which is a business membership group to get business leaders to advocate for early childhood as unexpected champions. So both my plea and my question is, how do we spread this message far beyond the people who already believe in early childhood to the finance ministers, the budget people, the powerful allies in countries who are not in the early childhood world?
I started with these 3 things that everyone can do. One was introduce and disseminate, the second was advocate, and the third was collaborate. I think I want to add, following Judy's intervention and Frank's and several others, that what we need to do, each one of us, is actually facilitate the conversation in whatever capacity we are. Ministries of education are present here, ministries of health are present here. If you are looking to get more investment from your country, whether it's financial or technical or buy-in, this is an opportunity to take evidence that is coming out of this stage to go to your finance minister, to go to your planning minister very concretely to say, this is what I learned in Beijing. I would like to have a briefing session. Can we talk about it? This is a beginning. This is one way we bring the cross-sectoral discourse together. So one of the advocacy messages we bring back to governments and to ourselves, every one of us in this room, that we have to facilitate this conversation.
The strength of this research is that if you intervene early, you improve multiple outcomes, not just one. And so in our country, when we talk to education ministers, we talk about its relevance to education. When we talk to health ministers, we talk to police about the relevance to policing. We talk to endocrinologists about reducing rates of diabetes and obesity, etc., etc. But what's important is the message has to get framed in different ways. And in answer to your question about business, they're critical to the conversation because it's a global marketplace now. And as you heard this morning on the videos, a country's most valuable resource is its social capital. So you either pay now or pay later. And as we've heard, intervening late in the course is largely ineffective and very, very expensive. So a prevention agenda is very important. But I think this isn't about early childhood. This is really about society. And building social infrastructure, to my mind, is as important or more important than building physical infrastructure. So governments invest in roads and electricity grids and et cetera, for the next generation. This is more important than that.
My name's Josh Fader. I'm a child psychiatrist from San Diego, California. My work is in providing training for responsive caregiving really all over the world through distance learning kinds of processes. But my biggest problem is trying to help people who are in the field, the caregivers, parents or teachers, help us assess how a child is doing and finding measures that are reasonable and not expensive to do, because we can't really do video monitoring research for all these kids. So I wonder if anybody has suggestions of specific maybe measures of or indicators of engagement to be able to track what we're doing in a meaningful way.
The East Asia-Pacific region has been quite active in developing metrics and assessments. And, we are still, in many countries in the region, we have early learning and development standards, based on which we have a tool now called the East Asia-Pacific Early Childhood Development Scales, which measures 7 domains of development. I think Dr. Nirmala Rao may be in the audience, and if she is, if I may ask her to stand up. She, from Hong Kong University, they have led the effort for measurement for 3 to 5-year-old children, 7 domains of development. There's a shortened version of the scale that will be available after some time. But we just want to add that because such scales and administration of such scales are quite complex, we are also looking at, doing this in a multi-layered fashion. We can provide more details later, but there are tools available in the region. Globally, we have several measures. We have an early childhood development index, which has been used in multiple indicator cluster surveys, which measures, at least at a basic level, how children are performing.
What are the plans for professional development, teacher education, but also with teachers, also head teachers, etc., people who are leading this effort so that people can become managers of this change? I don't know whether we've got already materials being developed for teachers, caregivers, leaders. Thank you.
Okay, Judy has a comment to make.
Yes, so I think there's a lot of interest in developing tools. I talked briefly about the game we're developing to talk to communities, but we're also developing a whole series of activities that people can participate in that teach them about brain development. And many of our targets are teachers, but we really think that the entire community needs to know this. So we have programs in place for targeting teens, for targeting senior citizens, as well as the whole professional base within the community. Our feeling is if people all understand what's important for child development, children will have a much better chance of getting the interactions that they need.
So for Dr. Lye, there are some recent studies linking cesarean delivery to alter microbiome in the child, which may have long-term health and developmental implications for the child. So I'm wondering if you can comment on that in relation to the very high cesarean delivery rate, 30% in the United States, more than 50% right here in China. And then for Dr. Cameron, I came across some studies recently that demonstrated differences in the brain scans of orphans in the Romanian orphanage,
right.
that based on the timing of when they were adopted. And I think that's right around 2 years of age.
Yes.
And I was wondering if you can comment on the importance of timing in relation to these early child development programs that often start at age 3 or 4.
The microbiome is going to revolutionize how we understand human health, without question. I mean, we're now thinking about humanness together with our microbial partners in life as a single entity that we're calling the holobionte. So we and our microbes form a singular organism. And so these microbes support our bodily functioning, our brain function, our immune system, and in some ways they are controlling our behavior. They release chemicals that affect our appetite, affect some of our food preferences, and certain conditions like obesity impact our microbiome. So we're trying to understand this complex interaction with these microbes because they form a remarkable way to intervene and improve human health. Intervening with damaged microbiomes can support freedom from infections. Intervening with damaged microbiomes can cure obesity. And we just don't know where this is eventually going, but it's an emerging area that I think will be fascinating over the next few years.
You brought up the brain imaging studies out of the orphanages. That was a study developed by the MacArthur Foundation and a really good example of translational neuroscience because that study was developed based on the work in monkeys, showing that the timing of intervention makes a big difference. Early timing matters. And so you're exactly right. They were able to show that children that were adopted out of the orphanages and went into foster care young had a much better chance, and you could see the changes in the structure of the brain than if the children were adopted at 3-4 years of age. And yet many of our interventions start at 3 years of age. I've spent a lot of time in the United States really advocating for early Head Start, but that starts at 3. And so we need to intervene earlier, and I think that was a wonderful demonstration of that.
So does the current brain research give any insight to this question of the role of the mother tongue, especially for minority language speakers? Thank you.
Okay. Dr. Singhi?
That's a very good question, and a debatable one. I think, I had the opportunity to give another talk in which I reviewed at least 15 papers on this subject. And the current consensus is that while mother tongue is absolutely important, so you don't give it away, but if there is a second language, and language, the critical window for language is mainly up to 10 years of age. So children, if they learn early, they can cope with 2 languages or sometimes even 3.
So let's put these packages together so that all of us start to become accountable to achieve the joint result. The result of reduction in the preventable loss of early developmental potential and the result of increased access to quality early childhood programs in development and humanitarian contexts. And I ask you to join this phase going forward. Take any of these actions forward, leverage your networks, leverage your strengths, whatever you have to take these forward. Because in the words of my executive director, Anthony Lake, this knowledge is irrefutable. The moral argument is strong. The investment case is persuasive. The sustainable development goals momentum is behind us. But the power to act is in our hands. Thank you, everyone.